So now we're going to work on manipulating a person shot. And so I have a picture I downloaded online, and we're going to kind of fine tune a few things on her skin and also make some manipulation adjustments to certain parts of her face. If that's something a client requests, and they do often. So you'll now know how to do it. So we're going to go ahead and unlock our layer. I just opened the photograph, and there's a couple tricks that I can do to kind of even out her skin tone and to remove any kind of unwanted little skin marks. So one of the things I like to use is the clone tool. So it's called the clone stamp tool. So go ahead and highlight that. And I'm actually going to make it a little bit smaller of a brush size. And I want to make sure it's going to cover up just that little point. So I'm going to make the brush size a little bit bigger than the actual mark. And here's how the clone stamp works. You're going to hold down the Option key, and if you're on a Windows, I believe it's the Control key, but on a Mac it's the hold down the Option key. And I'm going to be able to take a sample. Just click my mouse once wherever I want to take a kind of a color sample. I'm going to take something really close to the skin next to it, just to get the right shade and the tone of that particular area. So I'm going to click right next to it, and now I have the clone stamp tool. So if I go over here and I go ahead and click my mouse and hold, and I kind of paint, it actually paints clones from that area. So you can actually paint from that whole side. And what's great is I release my mouse and I can do it again. And it'll continue to do that until I take a new sample. So if I hold down Option or Control and I sample her eye, I can come out over here and paint an eye. And I can come back, take another sample of the other eye, and paint an eye. So that's kind of just really quickly how the clone tool works. So I'm going to go back in my history to where we were, and I'm going to go ahead and take a sample. I'm going to take a sample here, and what's great about covering up a small mark on the face, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So I took my sample, and I just click once, and it usually covers up nicely. Or sometimes you click again, and you're good. So you can see how that blemish just disappeared. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Hold down, and I'll take a sample nearby, maybe right here, and pop it over there. I'm going to continue to do the same thing. I want to take this lighter, see how her skin's more red here. Her skin's more peachy color here. So I'm actually going to click and cover it up that way. You can do the same thing with blemishes right here and cover it up. And so that works for really small blemishes. But there's times if you have to cover up maybe a large scar or something else that needs to be touched up, sometimes the clone tool doesn't do the right job. And so you'll need to actually take the brush tool and paint some skin tone on it. So we're going to do that in the next video. So let's say we need to smooth out kind of this redness and freckles on our nose. And so one way to do that, you can't really clone anything around it because this is exactly the area that we want to change. So what I'd like to do is take the eyedropper tool, which is going to be right here in your toolbar, and I'm going to sample. You can sample any color, and it'll pop out up here, and it'll pop out here in your swatch panel. You can sample lip color. I'm going to sample a color that I think will go good on her nose. So it's probably going to be in this area right here. I'm going to try not to select a hair. So maybe right here, and you click a couple times, double click your swatch to see if that's a color you think would be a nice skin tone. And I'm going to create a new layer. And this is where I'm actually going to paint on kind of a new skin color for her on her nose. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the brush tool, and I'm going to make sure it's the right size. I always use feather brushes for a lot of my work. I rarely use the straight edge brush. So you'll see me use that all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm on a new layer. I'm going to be painting over her nose. And it looks a little crazy right now, but we're going to end up deleting and erasing a lot of this. Okay, and I'm also going to I like to create new layers for each section of skin. I do this just so I can have control over deleting and doing some adjustments. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab the eyedropper tool, and then I'm going to select some skin that I think is a nice even skin tone. So this is the tricky part. So maybe right here, and I'm going to go back and I'm just going to paint. I'm going to do the same. That might be a little dark. So let me go back and grab a new sample. Maybe right here, and then I'm going to paint. I'm on a new layer, And notice how the light is coming onto the right. I'm actually going to create a new layer. So to do her right cheek, I'm going to take a new sample and do the same thing because this is going to be a much brighter, lighter color than on this side where there's shade or shadow on her face. Okay, so we do the same thing on a new layer, just kind of paint around. So this looks a little ridiculous right now, but we're going to end up kind of screening a lot of this back. So I'm going to start with the nose layer, and I'm going to reduce the opacity on it until I'm happy with kind of how it's blending in. So right about there, and I'm going to take the eraser tool, make it kind of a decent size so the feather has a nice feathering. But I want to keep the shadow. So there we go. Do the same thing on this side, reduce the opacity, and I'm going to go back with the eraser tool and just kind of go back. So now this is the darker, the shadow side. I'm going to reduce the opacity first. We're just really smoothing out her skin. We're not really changing her skin or eliminating all. You want her to look realistic. So let's go ahead and zoom out and kind of see what we did here. Let's see if I do 70%. So let's go ahead and take out all of these layers. So this is before, and this is after. So you can kind of see how the nose looks a little better. It's less red. And I would even reduce the opacity even more because you really want to keep some of the things underneath. You want to have some freckling. You want to have some realism. So this is really just kind of a subtle smoothing out the skin. You're not changing the skin. So there it is. Let me take away all the layers so you can see. So before, after, and this may need some adjustment. May need to erase a little bit on this side. Oops, not that much. I want to have a little bit of that shadow there. This just takes time and practice to master. I could do the same thing for the chin. Around her lips needs a little bit of work. So that's it for evening out skin tone. So now that we've kind of evened out our skin tone a little bit, I want to kind of add a little bit of more of a dynamic eye and some more highlights and shadows just to kind of bring out some of that with her. So I'm going to go over to the Dodge and Burn tool, which could be right down here. It's already highlighted. So Dodge and Burn, and I use these quite a bit. The Dodge tool is when you want to add highlights to any object, and the Burn tool is if you want to add shadows to any object. So I want to bring out highlights in her eyes. So let's do the Dodge tool, and I'm going to set it on highlights. You can actually go up here. Make sure you adjust the range if you're not getting anything you like. Go back and play around with highlights and shadows. Different options to figure that out. I like highlights. That's going to be more dramatic. Let's try 100% exposure. Of course, we can always go back and reduce that exposure if it's too harsh or too bright. Let's go ahead and zoom in on her eye a little bit. And we're just going to brush it on. It's just like a brush with a lot of things in Photoshop and the tools. To brush it on. Just going around her eye, and it's bringing out highlights in the little areas right there. So you notice how her eye is much more dynamic. And you can overdo this for sure. So if I went back and did it again, it starts to look almost alien-esque. So let's just go ahead and do that, because that's perfect. That's all we really need to do. We need to add a little bit of the Burn tool. This is going to add shadows. So if I go like along here, it's going to actually add shadows. And a lot of times I like to do eyebrows and maybe even bringing out a little bit of the eyelashes, just a little bit deeper, darker, fuller looking eyelashes. I really don't use this too much, just to kind of bring in shadows. Maybe let me go down to highlights. Just experiment to see. I always do my Control Z, which is to go back a step with my keyboard. If I go and I don't like how it looks, I can just do Control Z, and I can continue to do that. So you can see how you can bring out kind of some dramatic effects with this. Let me actually do shadows. Let me bring down the exposure. I want it to be very subtle, just a little darker, just to kind of make her lips look a little more lively. That's all we're doing. We're not doing anything outside of that, and we probably even could have backed off doing the eyes a little bit more. But you see that made a pretty big look. This is the original. So I'm already kind of seeing when, this is very wise to do. Always go back to your original, which is all the way at the top here in your history, and then go back to new and switch back between them. And what I'm finding out is I'm not liking how I evened out the cheeks. I'm not liking that at all. I kind of like the more natural look, so that's no problem. I have these in different layers. So I'm going to take out the cheeks. I like the nose, so let's just take out the 2 cheeks. Or maybe reduce the opacity a lot on those, instead of making them disappear altogether. So now when I go back to the original, a little bit better, let's actually reduce it on our nose. Make those all more subtle. And so now we're going to actually use the liquefy tool.